It's going to be my honor to introduce our next speaker. We have Robert Wood. He runs the security and compliance team at NUNA, whose core directives are to protect one of the nation's largest collective healthcare data sets. Previously, he was a principal consultant at Cigil, where he founded and led the Red Team assessment practice and worked with strategic clients across the United States in an advisory capacity. Here we go, Robert Wood.
Thank you, sir. Interesting. Maybe? There we go. Computers work. All right, good morning, everybody. Let's get to it. All right, so, that light is bright. So this morning we're going to talk about the age-old battle between regulation and compliance and security, where most of us likely fall, and some of the challenges that end up coming into that battle when those things are at odds with one another. Even though regulation and compliance was kind of brought into being with the best of intentions, so things like NIST and ISO and all of these frameworks out there, they were introduced to try to make us all better and give us some structure. And so I want to share some personal stories about how we've handled some of the at odds and craziness things that come up between juggling security and best practices around security and some of those regulatory requirements. So Reed touched on this. I run the security and compliance teams at NUNA. We're a healthcare analytics company based down the road here in Soma, and we work with very large employers, health plans, government agencies, et cetera, to help them deliver better, faster, cheaper healthcare services through a variety of analytics products. And probably the most important thing down here is I'm a massive Batman fan. My wife calls me a fanatic. I teeter-totter. Anyone on my team will tell you it's probably the latter. So first things first, I want to cover what is the actual problem and what are some of the symptoms of this bigger compliance versus security issue. And I think it boils down to three main things. The first being that there are a zillion frameworks out there. You've probably all seen the XKCD around like making one framework to rule them all and just ending up introducing another framework on top of n number of, you just end up with an n+1 problem. And so we're drowning in this complexity that is compliance that comes from government regulations and customers and maybe internal organizational policy, and it's just a lot of stuff to manage for already overburdened security teams. And then, we've probably all heard this story, the compliance is security theater. So when we see compliance companies end up on the front page of the Times or the Wall Street Journal after they suffered some kind of breach, and we have to ask ourselves, what's going on there? Why is that? How is that possible? And then something I'll refer to as the gotta catch 'em all, or the Pokemon syndrome in compliance. And so digging into each of these a little bit more, so to give you a snapshot, so NUNA is a relatively smaller, newer player in the healthcare scene, but since we are dealing in the healthcare data space, we're pretty much automatically subject to HIPAA, the HIPAA security and privacy rules, as you might imagine. But beyond that, based on the customers that we end up engaging with, we've already tracked and kind of put ourselves in a position where we have to track over 8 different standards, which ends up leading us to track over 300 plus controls, unique controls across all of these. And then on top of that, we end up dealing with customer-specific audits, which can come at any time, but at most happen annually. We end up with the possibility of random OCR audits, and then we have to, of course, conduct our own internal assessments and audits to satisfy all of these other requirements, which, if you're familiar with going through that process, is a lot of overhead for any security team. And what ends up happening is I end up looking like this in the straitjacket, and it's, it ends up leading into this tension where, the customer shows up or somebody shows up on site or calls up or sends an email, and they're like, we need you to go through, to jump through this hoop for us. And, many security teams will end up just kind of rushing to the door to, to show them these massive spreadsheets. If anyone's familiar with dealing with compliance in the government space, they used to track all of this stuff in these big, massive binders, and they would just hand auditors, trapper keepers of compliance controls. And it's, if you might imagine, this is why our government employees resemble this, and it's not pretty. The next thing, security or compliance as security theater. So a few reasons why I think this ends up being the case. That is, compliant companies, consider like your Targets and your Home Depots, end up falling victim to breaches. So anytime that you're going through any kind of assessment or an audit, you're of course going to put your best foot forward. So teams are going to, maybe kind of spin things in the right way. They're going to really polish things up. They're going to, clean it. It's like cleaning up before company comes over. You want to make sure everything's in its right place. You vacuum, you put everything away. You don't have your laundry laying out everywhere. And this is kind of what's happening with any time that we go through assessments. So that way we can achieve that business objective that the company needs to get compliance to not fall victim to fines, to enable business development, things to that effect. And then beyond that, because compliance oftentimes maps directly to some kind of business objective, i.e. not getting fined or enabling business development, what I've seen in many, many cases is that budgets only go so far as enabling compliance. You're only going to get enough money to handle or implement the processes, the controls, et cetera, that are covered by whatever frameworks you're subject to, whether it's PCI or HIPAA or ISO or NIST, whatever. And beyond that, I'm sure you're all familiar, like control frameworks don't cover everything. So for instance, in all of those frameworks that we're covering, the words phishing or social engineering or anything pertaining to social engineering attacks or human-based attacks isn't mentioned or referenced anywhere. The only thing that's mentioned or referenced is that we do an annual PowerPoint 15-minute security awareness training, which, I'm sure if any of you guys have gone through those, is not really a sufficient thing to guard against or to enable people, empower people to guard themselves against one of arguably like the most prevalent attack vectors that are leading to a lot of these breaches today. And so, why is that? And then third, we're going to talk about some of the gotta catch 'em all syndrome. And this is really where people become so enamored. This is why I call it the Pokemon syndrome. Any Pokemon Go players in here? Show of hands. Or friends who have, there we go. Friends who have played Pokemon Go. So I've watched people like walk into ladders and do all sorts of crazy things, playing their games and or just being on their phones. And so what this ends up looking like is people become so enamored tracking these controls that they forget about everything else around them. They forget about best practices. They forget about making sure that the controls they're implementing, this guy doesn't die, don't worry. He comes close. So we end up forgetting about the things that are right around us, or making sure that that the controls that we're implementing or the processes we're implementing are actually effective. And we'll do one more. That's akin to what I ended up witnessing. And so we end up in this situation where we don't really care about, are the things we're implementing effective? And that's a big problem, because if something's not effective, if it doesn't cover the entire scope of what it should be covering, but you've just checked your box to move on, then you're going to end up in a big issue, in a big problem down the road. And so this is an issue that I've run into a few different times, is cases like this where you end up with regulatory policy over here and organizational policy over here. And if you guys can read the text in here, these are kind of summarized versions of the controls that were covered. And if you notice in the organizational policy, it's kind of gnarly. It's not something that you would actually want to do. So they're basically saying network traffic to databases, from applications to applications, whatever, must be unencrypted so that way we can effectively monitor it. Well, that's not cool. for anyone who is familiar with the pen testing landscape, or just configuring and actually guarding these systems, we know that that's not cool. That's not kosher. But that is something that an organization that I've worked with actually enforced upon system owners across the organization. But at the same time, they had all of these other regulatory policies to make sure that they satisfied, such as encrypted network services must be used wherever possible, and then all of these other things. And so what this ended up looking like is they ended up shrinking down the scope, or kind of dumbing down all of these other controls that were arguably best practices, or things that they should be doing in some form or fashion, just so they could satisfy and catch them all. The network traffic must be unencrypted. And there was a lot of just excuses, and it was, once you started shaving the yak, it never seemed to end. It was excuse after excuse, and exception after exception, and it was really gnarly. And so from all of that, we have to ask ourselves, that's where we are today, or that's where we have been, and how do we start to change that? And so some things that have been effective for us at Nuna is to first figure out the people or entities that can help you drive change, or those that actually care about change, whether they just care about compliance, or whether they care about the bigger picture of security, actual security. Figure out what's important to them. Are they worried about business development? Are they worried about making sure that customers trust them? Are they worried about marketing image? Things like that. The more stakeholders you can identify around your company that actually care about some of the fallouts, or one of the fallouts that might come from any kind of breach or compliance issue, find those people and figure out what's important to them. Figure out what language they speak. That way you can use their kind of jargon when you're aligning and partnering with them. And then right off the bat, start to make your efforts visible. So we in this industry have a gnarly habit of operating in this OPSEC, or behind the iron curtain fashion, where we don't want everyone to see how the sausage is made. But if you can show people how the sausage is made and what's behind the curtain, then people can start to see just how much work there is to do, and how little compliance actually ends up scratching that surface. And so one thing that's helped us is to think about actually having this global list of things to talk about. So in many organizations, I'll focus just on Nuna, with the products that we manage, of those 8 different standards, and some of those standards or requirements come from specific customers on specific products. And so if we were to start to try to manage this mapping around, only customer A and B care about standard, this standard relative to this product, but customer B cares about 2 different standards relative to 2 different products, and it just becomes a giant mess. And so the Cloud Security Alliance has published this fantastic mapping that covers a lot of the things that you're probably dealing with, or will have to deal with at some point, in terms of compliance standards, that you can take that as a starting point and figure out what are the industry relevant standards that I have to adhere to. Is it because of the space that I'm playing in, whether financial services or healthcare, energy, telecommunications, whatever? Are you working in the public or private sector? Or are you planning on building something that might be sold to the government in some form or fashion? Because if so, that opens you up to a whole new bucket of fun. And then are you running everything on premise in some way, or are you starting to outsource things to cloud vendors of some form or fashion? Because that will kind of dictate or influence what kinds of things that you start to look at, and the scope of the control sets that you have to manage. And what I mean by that is things you may be able to cleave off a lot of requirements that you have around availability, or the way that virtualization or hypervisor layer controls are managed, just to use an example. And then within that global framework, you can start to funnel in other things that need to happen. So we did this at Nuna. We started to throw in other best practices, other capabilities, things like threat modeling, and things like static analysis, and running manual penetration tests instead of just regular Nessus scans, things like that, into this massive framework. And so that way, when we're being transparent and showing people just how much work there is, and how much of it we're doing on a regular basis, that can start to influence budget decisions and budget discussions. And then past that, as I mentioned, we end up getting a lot of customer requirements, as I'm sure some of you folks in the audience do as well. And you have to start to tease out what are the specific asks that come from your customers that can inform the direction that you want to take your security program. And you have to either figure out how to map those asks to something that you're already tracking or plan to track, or you just add that in as another security control. Some examples of things that we ended up getting from particular customers during like an RFP process or a bidding process were, you need to have some kind of data loss prevention policy or capability in place. You need to have controls to restrict the use of USB drives on your laptops, something like that, stuff that's not covered in a normal compliance framework. And then what you end up with when you have this funnel of a global controls matrix is you can present this document when it's pushed together to a customer. You don't have to worry about going through all of the specific hoops and jumping through all of those things to pass a customer audit. If you're dealing in the enterprise space, you're likely to end up dealing in the enterprise space that is selling to enterprise customers in a B2B fashion. You're going to end up going through a lot of these things because they have their own very robust vendor governance programs, and they'll want to audit you and test you and make sure that you're up to their standards. And so if you can show them the standards that you're at and then let them deal with the work, that'll save you a lot of time. And in our world, time is everything. So the next thing I want to talk about is reframing the risk narrative. And what I mean by that is we need to get away from just labeling things as high, medium, and low risk. And so the CIA did a study back in the 90s, and some folks here may have read it, but it was on the psychology of intelligence analysis. And what they did is they took about 20 to 25 national security relevant events, and they ranked them high, medium, low. Just that, high, medium, and low. And they varied who they were delivering these results to, who delivered them, the time of day, and the order in which they delivered these results. And what they found through doing this is that people's interpretation of what high, medium, and low meant varied very drastically depending on the order, depending on who presented them, things to that effect. And if we think about that in our world, if you don't have somebody very compelling, giving this decision maker the risk breakout, the risk landscape, if you will, within your organization and telling them what high actually means, then you're likely to end up with a lot of different opinions across your decision makers' minds. And so, I would urge you to start to think about measuring things in terms of numbers. So, and you don't have to be perfect. We don't need very, very complete data. You don't need to go engage a vendor to do this who've done big data analytics and machine learning on risk numbers, to throw a few buzzwords in there. You can do it as simply as saying within the next year, this event within a 90% confidence interval could happen anywhere from 5 times to 15 times, depending on the threats that we kind of deal with and expect. And from an impact perspective, this thing might cost us anywhere from $100 if it happens to $10,000, which would be a pretty nominal mishap, versus something like let's say a SQL injection issue on your flagship app that could extract and expose all of your customer data. That could cost you much more in the hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. And so it'll help you prioritize by numbers, and this is a way that a lot of finance teams do it, because finance teams, of course, dictate our budget. How much risk you're actually at, and they can start to model these things and think about them in a little bit more sane manner. It's much harder to argue with numbers than it is high, medium, and low, because everyone's going to have their own interpretation of that. And then past that, we can start to align capabilities with strategic objectives. So all of those people that you found in the beginning of this that actually care about compliance, care about security in your organizations, start to build a mental model. This does not have to be a big formal mapping. You don't have to script anything, but start to build stories around the various capabilities that you're developing and fostering and building and maintaining in your organization. So things like incident response, things like disaster recovery and business continuity and vulnerability management, stuff like that, those big broad categories that all of these controls roll up into. You don't need a specific breakdown of everything that everything that funnels up into a capability, but you should have stories around how these capabilities map to and help achieve or help support those business objectives. And what we found is when we start to have those kind of discussions, you map it to an OKR or a KPI, objective and key result, or a key performance indicator within your organization. Executives can start to see that, hey, this thing over here, this objective, whatever measurement tool or that they use to guide their strategic decision making, this thing that I care about over here is going to be directly impacted based on the performance of this particular capability. And so if that's a really big one for them, then maybe that's a reason to funnel more resources into it. And so moving into more of an implementation perspective, you first have to figure out, or one of the early things you have to figure out is, what are you actually working with? What platforms and tools and cloud service providers are you building on top of? What vendors are you using? And you have to figure out what your shared responsibility looks like. So think about the shared responsibility model of AWS in terms of AWS is going to handle these things at the underlying layers, and then you're responsible for everything that happens on top of it. It looks very similar in a compliance and security perspective. You can't end up bringing in a bunch of vendors to handle and process and store and compute on your sensitive data or your most valued assets who are not up to the same standards that you are. I'll use an example from a vendor that we recently evaluated or in the process of evaluating, and we have a vendor governance process. So we send out questionnaires to folks, and we ended up getting in the response an LOL to one question that we asked. Like, do you do this particular security thing? And their response was LOL. Right. And so, like, if an auditor were to come in and we were to give them all of this stuff, their response would more likely be WTF, not LOL. Like, they would not find it as funny as this particular vendor did. So, figure out what your shared responsibility model looks like with regards to all of the things that you're building on or using or the people you're engaging with. And that'll help you figure out what controls actually matter to you and what ones don't. And they all ultimately matter, but what ones you have to actually track, or which ones you can just say, we're using vendor A, drop a link into their compliance page and say, we're done with it. We trust them to handle this particular area of our organization. And one idea that we've been experimenting with lately is this idea of adopting test-driven development to test-driven compliance. And so writing tests or starting with a condition that fails on a particular control. So is X encrypted? Is X resource encrypted? Is this network connection encrypted? Things to that effect. And you won't be able to do this across your entire portfolio, but the more things that you can adopt and build automated tests for in a similar fashion that we would any kind of quality function, you can start to track these things as part of your CI/CD pipeline. You can start to deliver results or bugs to the developers that are potentially turning things off or writing something new that doesn't conform to the standards that you're rolling out at your organization, and you can put the responsibility back on them to fix a bug and not necessarily deal with compliance. It's all about framing. Just as in the same way that we don't go to a developer and say, or at least we're not anymore, according to the trends that we're on, we don't go to a developer and say, you have N number of vulnerabilities to deal with. We say, you have N number of bugs to deal with. It's all bugs, whether it's a quality bug or a security bug. It's all issues that negatively impact the performance of the system that you're working on. So please address it. And you can start to work with your build or ops teams to fail builds based on certain things happening or certain conditions not being met. And this again feeds into that idea of monitoring and reporting on the state of your compliance program. And so then we start to think about, if we're tracking all of these things, we start to be able to generate metrics for them, which is great. Metrics are fantastic. And if you're running these things on a case-by-case basis, point-in-time audits, then it becomes very difficult, or you're not getting very timely metrics, like doing a quarterly assessment as an example. However, if you're running a lot of your control stuff through a CI/CD pipeline, and you can start to track these things, how they're performing over time, how quick are you to remediate a particular control gone wrong, things to that effect. That provides a much more compelling story to auditors as well as to the decision makers within your organization. And you also start to introduce this concept of transparent reporting. And transparent reporting, what we found, is a very, very effective tool for increasing social pressure on people. So whether it's social pressure on an executive or social pressure on a developer, if somebody introduced an issue and everybody knows about that issue being in place, then they have more pressure on them to fix it. And this works even in executive circles. So if you're doing roll-up reports to an executive team or to a board, highlighting where all of these all of these things stand from a coverage perspective, from we're 80% of the way there in business continuity disaster recovery, 90% on incident response, et cetera, and you start to call out which director or which executive is responsible for these things. Nobody likes to look foolish in front of their peers, and this is not necessarily a tool to make people look foolish, but everyone wants to make sure that their stuff, their house is nice and polished anytime the company comes over. And so this is a way to start to do that. And what I want to highlight is this relationship right here between the strategic alignment with capabilities and the metrics. So if you can start to build metrics around the capabilities that you're tracking and want to track and that are important to key stakeholders, then you can start to tell really compelling stories to both auditors and to internal execs or people who are influencing or controlling budget. And so, moving into, how do we actually fight upstream? What do we actually do when these things are at odds with one another? So I think there are 6 main big takeaways. The first is making sure that we reframe the narrative around compliance, reframe the narrative around risk, and start to think more about how we can report towards people's intrinsic motivation. So, if they're motivated by again, business development or making sure that their customers trust them when they walk into a sales meeting or something to that effect, then talking to them in the language or in the narratives that they have is going to be a much more powerful story. Then this next one, so that way you don't end up in the straitjacket condition or the Pokemon syndrome, you need to identify why you actually need to be compliant and to what you need to be compliant to. So not everyone needs to be FedRAMP compliant, for instance. Only vendors who are building software to sell to a government agency of some form or fashion need to be FedRAMP compliant. And you don't want to be taking on something as massive and meaty as FedRAMP if you don't have to. It's not necessarily impressive if you're FedRAMP compliant and not selling to the government. However, if you need to or plan to, if your business wants to go down that road, finding those things out early so that way you can structure things accordingly is going to be a really, really important thing. And then this is where we start to think about the points 3 and 4, start to think about the social pressure and the transparency element. So we need to make our reporting personal to those who it actually matters. So this is very, very closely related to the intrinsic motivations, but we need to make sure that we're communicating in the same native tongue as the people who are, to who this matters, because compliance enables us to do business in some way. Compliance isn't necessarily bad, but it can be it's like a necessary evil in the organizations that we work. And then this was not mentioned in the past, but and this probably comes to no surprise, but make sure that you have some element of deadlines and directly responsible individuals or accountability when it comes to remediation of these things. You don't want to be on the hook in your organization for actually handling all of the remediation work that might come from any kind of audit or assessment. There's probably going to be a lot of it, and so if you can start to pinpoint the teams, the project managers, the business owners, et cetera, who are actually going to be responsible for managing all of these things, then it's going to benefit you in the long run. You're not going to have to do as much work to maintain it, to do the work initially, et cetera, because you've probably got your own massive bucket of work to handle on your plate. And then, of course, if you can start to, this ties back to the risk narrative, using numbers to drive how we talk about risk. If you're not just saying, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Developer, you've got a high risk vulnerability. When nobody actually knows what that means. And so if you're talking about, if this thing has with a 90% confidence interval, has a chance of happening 50 times this year, and it's going to cost us $50 million, which we know is going to put us under because that way outdoes our cyber liability insurance and blah blah blah, then you can start to work with people and come up with much more sane deadlines. Maybe you don't have, or maybe you do in your organizations, a set deadline based on risk for things to be remediated. In my consulting experience, I've seen that go both very well and extremely poorly, in the sense that some issues are just way too big to remediate in a set amount of time. And so, having these hard and fast rules that kind of blanket everything can sometimes be very difficult. And then, of course, in the compliance space, and this is one of those things that is counterintuitive to most, is we need to embrace automation much like we are in the rest of the security space. So compliance is kind of a subset, a sub-function of this broader generalized thing that is information security at our organizations. And the more that we can embrace automation to implement, to maintain, to course correct all of these different controls, the better position we're going to be in. And then, of course, as you're automating things, that allows you to start taking measurements on things. And if you can measure things, you can manage things. And once you can start managing things, you can set your own objectives that then roll up into the bigger KPIs, or again, whatever objective tracking tool that your executive teams are using. And so, with that, I will stop blabbering for a little bit and wrap up. And does anyone have any questions? And thank you. Oh, yeah, what's up? Sure. So the question was, and correct me if I paraphrase incorrectly, was for new people that are coming into the organization, how do you continually make sure that that your compliance initiatives or control implementation initiatives are accurately maintained and things don't go off the rail as as time goes on? Because we'll build something and controls and compliance and all of that is right on top of the business and everything's aligned perfectly, but very much like when you build a network and design everything appropriately, the business and compliance start to come out of sync with the rest of the the original technical vision. All right? So that's really where I think the automation comes into play. So the more and more things that you can implement via automation, it's just there. It becomes a part of people's normal workflows. The normal testing frameworks that end up being used and run against the code base that you're maintaining. And this of course gets a little bit more complex with the more and more products that you have, but if you're writing good tests and you really commit yourself to writing good tests, as any good quality function in an organization does, then it kind of self-maintains. And then from those controls that can't necessarily be automated, one thing that we've found really effective is identifying the business owners, basically mapping business owners to a particular capability. And so let's say business continuity is a great example. So that may fall, if we think about business continuity from a revenue perspective, an operations perspective, and a technical operations perspective. We may highlight two people, maybe one person in operations, one person in engineering, who's responsible for basically making sure that if things go off the rails, they're going to be the ones on the hook. And then we just have ongoing conversations with those individuals, and we put the pressure back on them to maintain these capabilities. And so we'll do things like tabletop exercises to where we're not measuring the effectiveness of a bunch of specific controls, but rather we'll just pick a scenario out of a hat and go talk to those individuals who are responsible, set up a tabletop exercise, and we'll drop this scenario on them, and everyone in their team will make it a cross-functional thing, and we'll make it fun and engaging and all of that. and we'll talk through how they would actually respond to the scenario. So like availability zone goes down, or somebody compromises our social media accounts and starts spewing a bunch of crap. Like, what do you actually do? Have you thought about all of these things? And if their answers are not very good or compelling, or if they just have no idea what to do, then that shows that they're not actually taking this thing seriously. And then we can start to work with them to create project plans, because ultimately, if you make it real for them, in the sense that something that they're responsible for is going to completely fall over because they haven't maintained this responsibility, then they're going to be the ones that look like the fools, not you necessarily. Like HR is another really good example, because there's so much HR related controls starting to get injected into like NIST and ISO and these other frameworks. Thanks. Any other questions? Yeah, so the question was, just to repeat, was when there's a lot of different platforms and tools and technologies at play, how do you manage all of that under one roof? Is that okay? So one thing that we've found effective is we've got a few different platforms, so to speak, across the business lines that we're maintaining. So one way is to try to just push people to consolidate. That's not actually an easy thing to do, and it's probably not actually very likely to happen. But one thing we've had to kind of adapt to, and this introduces a little bit of complexity, but is capturing somewhat of a scope, if you will, per control. And so something as simple as encryption at rest of data sources, and we would extrapolate that to a particular product and then an owning team. And so we have each of our controls mapped to somebody or a team who is going to own it and the product that it relates to, and it's kind of an additional mapping. And so a lot of controls, if you go through these frameworks like SOC 2 or ISO or NIST, are more organizationally focused, or at least there's a subset of the controls within them that are organizationally focused, and those are the easy ones to handle. But from a product to product perspective, we'll oftentimes we'll not really worry about the technology necessarily from a compliance management perspective. We'll just figure out what team owns it, what product it relates to, and then that's the specifics around managing technologies and all of that is more of a nuance that we'll deal with outside of this particular compliance like tracking, because then it just becomes way too cumbersome, at least from our perspective or our experience. Yeah, of course. So I'll paraphrase and let me know if I got it right. Do you ever look at, with regards to personal information or other high-value assets, how much of it is going into or out of a particular part of a system, and then how do you prioritize? Is that? Okay. So that's where I think the risk, like talking numbers around risk, really comes in handy. So, if we just use the ordinal risk scales to talk about, everything is high, medium, and low risk, it's all very much relative to the thing that you're talking about. For instance, if you engage a pen test team, and you have them come in and test, like let's say you have some organizational or regulatory mandate that says, thou shall have everything in your application portfolio manually pen tested by a third party. All right, great. That team is going to look at the scope of the thing that they're testing, and they're going to risk rank things in that high, medium, and low ordinal fashion relative to the thing that they're looking at. And so if you were to just step back and look at high, medium, low, critical, whatever risk issues across the entire set of reports that you end up getting, you're not really going to get much useful information, because you're going to have high risk, critical risk issues and a bunch of very, very low risk applications. Let's say you're juggling 100, 200, 300 applications. I found this very frequently when I was working with banks at Cigital, and they would have these marketing sites or other temporary advertising sites that went through almost no testing whatsoever. And they would just be subject to a manual test once every 2 years or something to that effect. And so of course they're littered with issues, but they don't really care because they're throwaway sites that aren't really connected to anything. And so that's where I think starting to talk about numbers when it comes to risk, if something were to happen relative to this particular scope, it's going to cost the business this much. And even if it has a really, really high likelihood of happening, it might happen 200-300 times in a year, or whatever kind of time cadence you set or use. If the impact is so nominal that it doesn't really matter, then you can way deprioritize those things. Does that make sense? All right. Any other questions? That's a good question. So the particular question was, how do you deal with issues that, let's say, something goes down and that thing going down does not itself introduce a business risk in terms of financial loss or something to that effect, versus something that is directly impacting the business, like the SQL injection or something or the data loss of some sort. So in that case, I probably that's actually a really good question. You could probably chain them together in the sense that, if this thing happens, if you would probably marry the two things together and look at them as one joined risk. So, if your intrusion detection system goes down, you're much more likely to fly blind. And if you don't see a risk, then or somebody poking around your network, then you're in for trouble in some way, shape, or form. So I'd probably just write that risk out as one thing, such as you're not able to see somebody stealing data or somebody accessing a particular system, and I would probably rank it at the greatest, the thing that would be most impacted. And so let's say it's somebody accessing some high value server. And you want to be able to see that, and the IDS going down is what's going to enable you to do that. And if it's out, then you're flying blind. Then I would focus on you're not able to see somebody accessing, or somebody accesses the high value server. That's X likely to happen because of the fact that this thing is maybe unstable, something to that effect, and therefore it could cost you this amount of money. So I'd probably just rewrite the risk. It doesn't necessarily have to be in my opinion, and everyone will probably have their own, but it doesn't have to be a very specific instance in all cases. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And like Reed said, please drink more coffee and have breakfast and be merry. So thank you. Well, that's very handy because my current one has like this weird bubble in it, and I was going to replace it. So I know, right? Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm glad it worked out timing-wise. I was nervous. I was like, oh shit, like the light was so damn bright.